Deputy High Commissioner of New Zealand, Mrs. Mary Thurston, Mr. Lim Cheon, Chairman of the Board of SKBI, Sim Kiboon Institute, members of the family of the late Mr. Sim Kiboon, and distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Singapore Management University, it's a great pleasure for me to wish you a warm welcome to this public lecture organized by the Sim Kiboon Institute for Financial Economics. It's also my honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alan Bollard. I didn't know that you were planned to speak here, what was it, 2 years, 2 months, 2 weeks, and 2 hours ago, or something like that. But I'm happy to see you in good health today. He was awarded his Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Mathematics in 1972, his Masters of Arts in Economics in 1974, and his PhD in Economics in 1977. He is currently the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. Before that, he served in the New Zealand's highest economic posts as Secretary to the Treasury and then as Governor of the Reserve Bank. In 1997, Alan accepted appointment as a Secretary to the Treasury in New Zealand, making him the country's top civil servant. As CEO of the Treasury from 1998 to 2002, he had responsibility for managing the Crown's finances and was the government's principal economic advisor. He was also seen as someone who believed in fairness and was committed to achieving fairness through the market whenever possible, rather than by regulatory means. As Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand from 2002 to 2012, he was responsible for domestic price stability, which is a great task to achieve, and oversight of the banking system, which in that period was also a very great and difficult task. His setting of key interest rates affected the cost of borrowing and the value of the New Zealand dollar, and he had to constantly chart a course through the narrow passage between the rock of inflation and the hard place of recession. Clearly, this called for unusual skills and an intimate understanding of the economic forces at work in the New Zealand environment. And in this position, as Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, he has helped steer New Zealand through the global financial crisis. Since 2012, he has served as the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat here based in Singapore. The APEC Secretariat is the body that promotes trade, investment, and sustainable economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region. Dr. Bollard advances APEC's agenda by executing APEC's work programs as mandated by leaders and ministers. Before he was appointed Secretary to the Treasury in New Zealand, and I go back in town now, Alan devoted considerable energy to a rather different kind of project, the restoration of the Moniac. When I read this, I had to say that I vaguely remembered what it was from my studies in my course in economics, but it was not some deranged banker, but a hydraulic device. And that's the reason why I remembered it. I was an engineer, so it was where engineer touched on economics. It was the Monetary National Income Automatic Computer, invented in 1949 by the famous New Zealand economist A.W.H. Phillips, to display the interrelated processes of a national economy. The Moniac was a brilliant conception constructed with the aid of scrounged materials, including war surplus parts from old Lancaster bombers. You can see where the excitement from the engineer in me started rising, right? Phillips went on to publish one of the most famous empirical papers in economics, one that we all cite, I guess, in one way or another, establishing the compelling Phillips Curve relationship between inflation and unemployment. Alan was clearly impressed, perhaps inspired by Phillips and the model he had invented, which had both analytical and educational value, and instrumental in finding the machine at the London School of Economics and raising funds to relocate it to the Institute. Alan proceeded to spend countless hours, I understand, getting the Moniac, the Monetary National Income Automatic Computer, back into working order. This project, calling for construction skill and sustained attention to detail, was no aberration for a man who assembled his own car from a kit set and does needlepoint of his own design. Alan later applied his talents to the development of the OIC, short for Oikonomos, where you are master of the economy, a multimedia software game where the player acts as Minister of Finance and attempts to run an economy. On this occasion, his creative output found its way to commercial production as an educational tool. And I have been told that a number of high-ranking officials have played the game but insisted on suppression of the results. Seemingly, it's not that easy to be a minister of economics or finance and run an economy. Alan is also a successful author. He wrote a best-selling account of the global financial crisis called Crisis: One Central Bank Governor and the Global Financial Collapse. And more recently has published a novel entitled The Rough Mechanical. Alan remains a natural, applied economic researcher prepared to gather data in the field and at the same time the organizational leader seeking to engage and educate his public. He frequently talks to business and consumer groups and seeks to discern firsthand the relative strengths of the various forces operating in the economy. I'm looking forward to what you have to share with us today on the three friends of winter, how economic policy has addressed the major crisis of our time, and it's an honor to invite him to present his present lecture to us here today. Thank you, Alan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, first of all, Professor De Meyer, for an over-generous introduction. And thank you to Singapore Management University for the invitation to give this lecture, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I want, first of all, to make a couple of qualifications. I have summarised a big sweep of history in this talk, so you will appreciate the fact that it's over-simple in many parts to try and get the bigger picture. I am often using data for the United States, not particularly because I'm interested in the United States, but because that's where we can find the best data. I want to insert some of my own personal experiences working in New Zealand, and I have a few observations to make about Singapore, although many of you here today were in the middle of the events that I'm going to describe. I'd also like to have your tolerance for an attempt to put this in a broader setting and to start off with the three friends of winter. Any artist can paint the greenery of springtime or the reds of summer or the oranges of autumn, but only the very best can paint the greys of winter. And to do this, Chinese ink brush painters have traditionally looked to those few types of vegetation that continue to grow through winter and show some signs of greenery or colour. And consequently, my talk today is put in the context of the three friends of winter, which are the pine and the bamboo and the plum. This picture you've got in front of you is 1,000 years old. It was done during the Song dynasty by painter Xiao Mingjiao, and it is one of these famous ones called Three Friends of Winter. But allow me now to step back from art appreciation to talk about economics, which is a much more recent part art, part science, and to talk particularly about economic policy, because against the 1,000-year history of this painting, economic policy is a very recent thing. Western economics really originated out of events like the Renaissance and Reformation and the growth of interest in moral philosophy and, more recently, the Industrial Revolution. But developments around those were generally made by economists who were either academics or church ministers or tutors for rich families. And if anything, they worked in ivory towers a long way away from centres of population and centres of government. They had little to do with business and little to do with government. And policy wasn't really something that had been thought of in the sense of influencing economies. But with the very big developments that went on in the last century, after World War I, things started to change. And people saw economics as something that could actually change lives. And they saw and developed ways of putting in place economic policy to do that, because they also, particularly with the growth of American economists and politicians in the world arena, wanted to change lives as well. To do economic policy, you need economic institutions. And it's after World War I that we see the formation and operation of central banks in many economies that are carrying out regulation around the financial and monetary sectors of the economies. And you also see treasuries or ministries of finance that are mainly focused on raising revenue for governments through various taxes, not so much income tax, but other excise taxes. And in doing that, are a reflection of the time that actually governments didn't have much revenue in those times and they had quite limited roles altogether. There were very few people trained as economists working for governments. In fact, if there was a general theme in, for example, the British civil service, it was Confucian. It was the best people are those who have classical training, not technical economics training. And at that stage, macroeconomics policy, such as it was more laissez-faire with an expectation that, as Margaret Thatcher said, applied to her father's grocery shop, you had to balance the books with your business as well. I would like to now introduce what I'm calling 3 economic winters, because in the last 100 years, we've had 3 very bad economic events. And here we are, we have a picture of US economic growth, because we can get it for this time period. And you can see up there 3 slightly stylised periods. First one on the left, the Great Depression, then the Great Inflation of the 1970s, and then the global financial crisis of the 2000s. And these are events that happened roughly 40 years apart. They each have had worldwide impact. They each have spanned significant new economic thinking, new policy tools, and, if you like, new economic policy heroes as well. And what I try and do for each of those in turn through this lecture is to identify a new economic artist and reveal that artist's economic masterpiece and indeed the economic tools that they have helped develop, which we now regard as commonplace. Each of these stories is a complex little process. None of this happens in a linear, straightforward sort of way. And I'd like to try and illustrate it a little bit with my own personal experiences as well. So let's go to the pine tree, the tree that symbolises endurance through winter. And it's an appropriate symbol for talking about the Great Depression in the 1930s. And you can see that in this graph of US unemployment through this period, because it was a terrible time when, after the 1929 stock market crash, we had a number of years of no growth and indeed contraction. The US economy contracted by 1/3, much worse than has happened in most European states today. And unemployment went up to about 25%, but probably a lot more because women weren't being counted and participation was very low. It was a massive economic policy shock and a massive economic policy challenge, and it came, as I said, at a time when the best views about economic policy were laissez-faire and balance your budgets. Singapore was hit very badly, actually, initially from the Great Depression, because one of the things that happened very quickly was a colossal fall in the price of tin and the price of rubber. And of course, Singapore did not have a social security system to help insulate people from that. And there was considerable difficult times here. Although, of course, what happened by the mid-1930s was with Japanese armament and Japanese expansion, some of it militarily into East Asia, the price of tin and the price of rubber very rapidly grew and actually helped stimulate this economy. There was further stimulation in the late 1930s when the British started building up big bases here, and of course, in particular, the Changi naval base, $500 million, massive exercise even in today's time, and that meant there was a lot of activity here during the 1930s. How did economists view all of that? Well, this inevitably is a story of John Maynard Keynes, that brilliant man who was born not quite into aristocracy, but pretty close to it, son of a Cambridge professor, son of the Lady Mayor of Cambridge, and he was a fully establishment figure. His friends were the top politicians of the day, the top journalists, and artists and philosophers. And he is famous for his 1936 publication, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And up till that point, the neoclassical view in economics had been, roughly speaking, that unemployment is determined by a market which has a price of labour in it. And Keynes said, well, if your economy has got a huge amount of slack and is struggling and stagnating, actually it's going to be more determined by the level of aggregate demand, i.e. by how much people are spending. And immediately there was a very big policy implication out of that, namely that that government should think about stimulating economies, something that's commonplace in our terminology today, but was radical, new, and not generally accepted when he came up with this. Keynes, what were the tools he worked with? Actually, his fountain pen and his spectacles, he wrote much of his book in bed. He had servants. He didn't use particularly much data. There weren't formal hypotheses of the sort that SMU would demand today out of any decent piece of work. There weren't big data sets. Actually, he didn't even have an economics degree. He had a statistics degree. But he had that brilliance and that time to have this view. And was it a surprise to him? No. Here's a letter from Maynard Keynes to George Bernard Shaw, and he says, I believe myself to be writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionise the way the world thinks about its economic problems. This would have been stunningly arrogant if it hadn't turned out to be true. And it marks Keynes and his life. But initially, the reviews from economists were critical. They didn't accept what he had to say as an economic policy tool at all. When one looks for examples of it, you look automatically at the United States and the New Deal, which was that bunch of programs that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had put in place starting from 1933 through 36 to try and address the terrible state that the US economy was in, and only came after the United States had seriously studied economic policy in the USSR and its approach to planning, and then gone off to study these new things called national socialist governments in Germany and Italy about how they were managing corporate planning as well. But actually, Keynes did not have much influence on Roosevelt's New Deal. Keynes hadn't been backward in putting his views out. As early as 1933, he was addressing letters to Roosevelt, care of a letter to the open columns of the New York Times, informing him about the beauty of his views, but these didn't really have much influence. Actually, Keynes had a meeting with Roosevelt in 1936. But again, we look at the New Deal and see some maybe ex post justification from Keynes's thinking for these policies during the Depression, but they weren't a driver of it. And indeed, let's remember, the New Deal opposed the whole principle of deficit financing. It took British economist John Hicks and American economists Paul Samuelson and Alvin Hansen to really rewrite Keynes' work and put it in the context of a neoclassical synthesis before it got much broader spread adoption and understanding by economists, and only after World War II into most or many Western economies. But interestingly, where I look to for the clearest example of the first application of Keynes's thinking is into New Zealand's own New Deal. Because in 1935 we had a new Labour government came in, and it actually put in place a number of quite radical social spending policies which did increase aggregate demand, and it was prepared to go to the market for deficit financing to do those. And this brings me to New Zealand, and can I just give you a little more of a personal story here, because my upbringing, like one or two others in this room, was from parents who recalled and had been traumatised to some extent by the Great Depression and the war. In fact, my father accounted that at Cambridge he had met Keynes and his wife, the Russian ballerina. We had politicians who had been brought up in a context of state intervention. So politicians were there to make things better for people, and that meant getting involved. And at university in Auckland, we had professors who'd come up with Keynesian learning for the most part. Much after that, in 1997, as Professor De Meyer said, I was appointed to Secretary of the New Zealand Treasury, and there, despite all the drama of the East Asian crisis that was going on at the time, we had a pretty settled fiscal policy that did owe its roots back to a lot of Keynesian and post-Keynesian thinking on the importance of what governments could do and what they couldn't do, how they needed to take a long-term focus, how they needed to have disciplined fiscal policy, and how important that would be when times were bad. Let me jump from the Depression to the next great economic winter, and this is the time of the bamboo, that plant which symbolises strength but with flexibility. And here it's a story about the 1970s, because during World War II, all involved governments spent hugely. Government spending increased to levels it had never been conceived of before, with emergency financing in many cases. After World War II, governments cut back obviously on arms spending, but they transferred a lot of that spending into social spending. So you had the Beveridge Report in Britain starting a social security system, the war on poverty by Kennedy and Johnson in the United States, and then in addition, Vietnam War in the United States and some other countries also led to a big increase in spending as well. Well, by the 1970s, the OPEC organisation, the oil petroleum exporting states, had managed to put in place a monopolised set of negotiations which resulted in two big oil shocks in 1972 and 1979. And a consequence of those was right around the Western world, we saw inflation kicking up to very high levels. The graph there in front of you is American inflation, which hit double digits in 1974 and remained very high for a decade after that. Singapore, a centre of world oil refining and oil trading, was not at all exempt from this and suffered this greatly as well. If you want to see some evidence of that, you might read the biography of Goh Keng Swee, and produced by his daughter-in-law, which is a very good read here today, and also the environment that Sim Kee Boon had to work in within that, which was a very difficult and volatile time with this huge inflation problem. Well, let me now move to the person who I think above all played a role in helping to solve these issues and direct new policy. And it's the person who was very usefully introduced to you by Professor De Meyer. It's a New Zealander called Bill Phillips. Maynard Keynes, as I said, was an establishment figure who moved effortlessly around the corridors of power. Bill Phillips was a young boy who grew up on a very remote farm in New Zealand, had to leave school during the Depression because the family ran out of money, managed to get an apprenticeship to become an electrician, worked on remote hydroelectric power projects in New Zealand, then picked up his swag and his violin and went off to see the world, travelled around Australia, worked in gold mines, he worked as a crocodile hunter, he set up back blocks movies, he was very keen on the movies, and he had developed some ways of showing new talkie movies. And then he got on a boat and he thought he was going to China, but the Japanese had just declared war on China at the time. It was a Japanese boat. He ended up in Japan. He was arrested in Japan. They thought he was a spy taking photos. He finally got to China, went up through Manchuria, and went on the Trans-Siberian across the Soviet Union, enthusiastically, if naively, trying to find jobs in things like mines, only to be told that they had plenty of political prisoners and didn't need Kiwi expatriates to do that sort of thing for them. To cut something of a story short, he, after World War II, enrolled in the RAF in Britain and was sent to Singapore in 1941, where his job was to be on one of the air bases and refit the RAF quite inferior planes that had badly underestimated the ability of the Japanese Air Force with new guns that would fire through the propellers, something that was quite revolutionary for the time, which he did. He was on the last ship out of Singapore in early February. He was caught in Java, and unfortunately he spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp in Bandung, which ruined his health. But being Bill Phillips, he took the opportunity to learn Russian and Chinese. He built several clandestine radios in that camp, And those of you who are interested can read about it in one of Lawrence van der Post's famous books about Japanese prisoner of war camps. But meanwhile, back in Britain after the war, he became a student and then, quite surprisingly, a professor at the London School of Economics. And he is world famous for finding and estimating what looked to be a surprisingly robust relationship between unemployment in Britain and money wages in Britain, something that became known worldwide as the Phillips Curve. And those of you who have done economics will have come across the Phillips Curve. It was a relation which seemed to hold in a number of countries across a number of periods, and a very intriguing one. Bill Phillips was not like Keynes. He didn't lie languidly in bed with his fountain pen. He was a different sort of man altogether. He was a great innovator. Yes, he built the world's first hydraulic analogue economic computer. There it is. It's called the Moniac. This particular one is in the Reserve Bank Museum in Wellington. If you ever get there, do go visit. On the other hand, if you get to London, you can see the number 2. It's in the Science Museum in South Kensington. It's a brilliant piece of engineering and economics, quite beyond its time. But for the Phillips curve, actually, Bill Phillips didn't use this machine. He used slide rules, logarithmic tables, flexible rules, and a lot of it was eyeball stuff, something that he actually regretted later on when it became very famous and highly criticised. His colleagues were not the literati of Bloomsbury. They were some technocrats. They were engineers who'd done optimal control theory, and he translated a lot of that into economics. They were the very first econometricians who led the way for people like your Professor Peter Phillips, who indeed studied with Bill at London School of Economics a bit later than this. I was very lucky to meet Bill Phillips at Auckland University, and he came across as a completely ordinary person. Here is his own analysis of his economic contribution. All I did was to set up a few hares for people to chase. Well, there were some hares, some chase, because I've counted at least 10 people who won Nobel Prizes for chasing Phillips' hares. But he was a very modest man, unlike Keynes. And he wasn't happy when he found that the Phillips curve sparked off the biggest controversy that we have ever seen in economics. It was his colleague Lipsey at London School of Economics, and then the Americans Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, who picked this up and started doing more work on the Phillips curve and pointed to the fact that here we had an unemployment-inflation trade-off in place. And that looked to have some quite interesting implications. And then we had policy economists saying, well, just a minute, here's this curve with this relationship. Perhaps we could actually decide, does this country want to have more employment or more price stability? Can't have both, but we've got a choice in there. And then we had politicians saying, here's a choice, this is what we're making. And for example, in the late 1960s, Ted Callaghan, British Chancellor of the Exchequer, announcing the British budget, said, we are basing this on the Phillips curve, which says that if we're prepared to put up with a little bit more inflation, we can have less unemployment and more growth. Now, the 1970s and the OPEC story in that last graph just changed all this, because quite suddenly we saw inflation creeping up across a whole bunch of these economies. And as that happened, the Phillips curve would say, well, inflation goes up, that means unemployment goes down, that means there's more growth. But that wasn't happening at all, quite the opposite. It seemed to be a whole bunch of countries entering this thing we called stagflation, highly problematic, and it called the whole Phillips curve into disrepute. Milton Friedman, in a famous lecture to the American Economics Association in 1968, said, this may have some short-run value, long run, it doesn't exist, it should be blown up. And he was followed also by Edmund Phelps, who won the Nobel Prize for his 1968 contribution last year, saying pretty much the same thing. They said, well, there might be a short-run trade-off, but if you target employment in the long run, workers and businesses are both going to preempt that by increasing wages and increasing prices, and what you'll get is inflation and a vicious circle, not a virtuous one. And then we had Robert Lucas coming out, also won his Nobel Prize, on something, repeating something that Bill Phillips had already said, which is the Lucas critique, which in its toughest form says a policy predicted is a policy that's preempted and therefore won't work, an identification problem. And this is a very gloomy view of policy and in a way marks a low point, I think, for economic policy makers who would like to know not just how things work but actually see them work as well. This was the dawn, if you like, of the new right focus on policy, and it came hard up against what had been a Keynesian-inspired policy activism, where economists were people who went out and did things and made things better, and here we are, we have a bunch of economists saying, actually, you're probably going to make them worse. And they pointed to traditional Keynesian fiscal policy and said, this is likely to be very political because you've got politicians who want to win the next election influencing these choices. It's also likely to basically have only short-term effects and longer-term could have negative effects. And if you try and increase spending when you've got a downturn, by the time you get that budget through your parliament, very likely you'll be on an upturn and you'll actually make it worse by spending in an upturn and contracting on a downturn. You'll be pro-cyclical. And there was a lot of work done all around this. And the policy implications that they had were markedly different. They said fiscal policy, you should do what we'd call a set and forget. You put your fiscal policy in place and leave it. So you set medium-term targets, you enshrine them in legislation, and you rely on automatic fiscal stabilisers. And that means that if the economy is in trouble, unemployment goes up, more people receive unemployment benefits, for example, and spend it, thus stimulating. If an economy is going hot, the government expects to get more taxes, you're pulling more money out of the economy, and so on. To them, they said ministries of finance shouldn't be focusing on discretionary fiscal policy. They should be putting a focus on structural reform. They should be making sure that markets work, particularly labour markets, because what they want to see is prices deciding and signalling where these resources should go. Their view on monetary policy was, yes, this can be the main stabilisation tool, but it should be focused on inflation or price stability. So it should have a medium-term inflation targeting focus, and it could be helped by working rules as well, because the new right economists said economists aren't that clever, especially policy economists. They are better off leaving these things to rules and making sure the market knows these rules are in place. So we've seen a growth of things like the Taylor rule, which says run your monetary policy depending on how far away you are from targets on inflation and capacity, and make it clear that you're doing that. Interestingly, Taylor, who hasn't yet won the Nobel Prize but probably will, much of this was also developed by Bill Phillips in his 1950s article. This broad Washington consensus got a lot of support and credibility from the operations of some policy economists, and particularly you would point to Paul Volcker at this stage running the US Federal Reserve, and he did use monetary policies designed like this to go through the very painful process of getting inflation out of the American economy after the very dangerous 1930s and sowing the seeds for growth to come back in. Can I have a personal moment again? In the New Zealand Treasury, Treasury in New Zealand had actually been a world pioneer before me on putting in place a Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was doing exactly what was being prescribed. Set your debt and your deficit targets in legislation, have those agreed by Parliament, and do disciplined budgeting in order to achieve those. Rely on automatic stabilisers. Make sure you're in a strong fiscal position. Sooner or later, your government will thank you for that, and even your Minister of Finance might thank you for it as well if he or she is gracious enough. Well, as the global financial crisis happened, that was the case that we saw how important that was in an economy like New Zealand. And of course, Singapore has been even stronger through that. In 2002, I was asked to go and head up the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Again before me, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand had been the world pioneer in following the prescription for monetary policy, so had passed the first legislation in the world for inflation targeting, requiring central bank to have a primary goal of flexible inflation targeting in the medium term. 23 countries have now followed that prescription, pretty much on the New Zealand model, and we think it's broadly worked. But of course, the challenge was to make that policy credible, to say to people, we are going to lift interest rates until inflation comes down. You better believe it, and we hope that you do, because if you do, it's going to be easier. If you don't, and you keep passing on inflationary increases through the workforce, it's going to be that much harder. And indeed, we had to increase interest rates in New Zealand to record levels in order to achieve that. And that was my first 5 years at the Reserve Bank. But little did I know what the second 5 years was going to be about, because the second 5 years was our third economic winter. And that is symbolised by the plum blossom, which surprisingly blooms in late winter before springtime, but says that springtime is ahead. And this, we hope, is a symbol for the global financial crisis. Because for someone like me who'd been in those jobs for a little while, we had seen the 1987 stock market crashes, we'd seen the LTCM debacle in the United States, we'd seen the East Asia financial crisis, we'd seen emerging market economy, Russia, Mexico, Brazil crises, we'd seen the tech wreck in the US, we'd seen the savings and loan debacle there, but the global financial crisis was by far the biggest shock we had ever seen. And certainly I had not expected to see one like that in my time. So you'll recall in 2007, the subprime crisis first showed its head. And by 2008, we had the terrible story of Bear Stearns and then Lehman's and the rest of those desperate rescues through the 2008 period. And you can see in this graph, which measures the VIX index, a measure of instability through financial markets, just what happened in that period of 2008, 2009, when suddenly trade just fell off a cliff. And I have to say that we in New Zealand, and indeed our colleagues in Singapore and the other East Asian central banks that we were in close contact with, did not know what was going to happen next. But in 2009 in Singapore, trade dropped by 1/3. That's a huge impact to have and to have to deal with. So by that time we were in world recession, and since then we've seen some recovery, but a very dubious recovery, and we've seen some economies, particularly in Europe, of course, in a stagnation and not yet out of it at all. Back to the London School of Economics, where they were opening a building in 2008, and the Queen of England said, "Why did no one see this coming?" And of course the answer is many had predicted this. Possibly too many had predicted it, and in some cases they've been predicting it for many, many years as well, which is not helpful. And I think a lot of us did get quite a shock. When we go back and look at this, there were many simultaneous causes going on, and throughout that there were regulatory problems, there were governance problems, there were greed problems. We had a systematic underestimation of tail-end risk. We underestimated the way in which there was going to be contagion through this newly globalised world where financial institutions were so much bigger and more central than they had ever been in the past, and where you really couldn't stop one economy passing on these terrible signals to another economy. Although in this part of the world and in Australia and New Zealand, we were less impacted because thankfully, and from some good skill, the banking sector remained in much better condition. We have learned, of course, that it's very difficult to model financial performance, much more than many areas of macroeconomics. It's difficult to tie a financial sector forecast into macroeconomy forecasts, and it's very difficult to deal with the discontinuities so that you know that variables are moving along like that, and then suddenly you get a big break in your data. That is very difficult for us, but it's meant that we've all had to focus on a new area called financial stability. And this is the area where I have looked for new artists to paint new paintings in the line of the plum blossom to deal with this new winter. And here we focus on a couple of American economists, Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff. And whereas you'll recall Keynes was this languid establishment figure and Phillips was this self-made, brilliant technocrat, these two are different again. Carmen Reinhart was a child refugee from Cuba. Ken Rogoff was actually a school dropout, and he went off and became a professional chess player on the international circuit. So we can assume again that we are talking about quite unusual people with some quite brilliant intellectual ability. The work that these two did started coming through in a prescient way very, very early on in the crisis. So in 2007, before subprime, they were working on it. In 2008, we started seeing some conference papers coming through, and they were examining a lot of data for financial and banking crises right around the world. And a couple of years later, they put this together in what has now become a famous book called, ironically, This Time is Different, because in many cases, of course, it's not different, it's the same. But we always think it's different. And they pointed to a number of similarities as they went back through 800 years of history and 66 countries and pulled out a whole bunch of data on banking, financial sectors and economic growth. And they found some very interesting results, broadly speaking, that if you have a bad banking crisis and it coincides with a bad economic crisis, you have a very serious problem on your hands. This book, unusually for an economics text, hit the New York Times top-selling list and stayed there for quite a number of weeks. The tools that Keynes and that Phillips used were no longer what we see here. This has all been a story about laptops and proprietary software packages and financial data, and some of it's annual, and some of it's financial market data by the minute or by the second, and allows for continuous time estimations. And indeed, some of the areas that Peter Phillips, your last lecturer, has himself pioneered in this area. And those ideas were all argued and swapped at conferences, and I had the chance to hear from both of them in a number of conferences around central banks, in a number of articles, a number of emails, and a number of blogs, some of them very angry ones. And I have for you a quote, this time from Paul Krugman, who says, Reinhart and Rogoff may have had more immediate influence on public debate than any previous paper in the history of economics. Now, I'm aware I'm speaking about another of your earlier lecturers in the series here, but I need to say this was not adulatory, this was a critical comment. He thought they had more influence, and it was bad influence. And quite apart from the hyperbole in here, it's not the paper with the most influence ever in economics. It has been clearly a very, very important one. And indeed, it has stimulated and been part of research by a lot more economists, because the population of economists has grown exponentially through this period as well. And they very quickly have picked up on the global financial crisis and decided that this is an area where actually we have been behind the ball, but that's no excuse. There needs to be a lot more work, and I know there's a lot going on right here at SMU. And the area of work I would draw attention to has been that work that has surveyed economies and tried to work out to what extent there was a build-up of imbalances in a way that reached a financial point at which it triggered a threshold where economies suffered in a very bad way, both a financial penalty and low growth or contraction. And indeed, a number of them have found, as did Reinhart and Rogoff, that there are some key points. And in Reinhart Rogoff's case, they said when your public debt gets to around 80%, that's the point where you need to start getting worried. There's other things that are influential, of course, but that is one point at which we do see growth falling away very significantly. And of course, in the European Union today, almost every country has growth well over 80% of GDP, has debt well over 80% of GDP. Although, of course, to be fair to Reinhart and Rogoff, they didn't see a simple causal relationship there either. This has sparked another huge controversy. On the one hand, you've got this sort of, let me label it, the IMF view, which is broadly what's there for the Greek rescue and some others in Europe, where they would say what's most important is, despite the very poor conditions and the very low growth, it's still important that you primarily work away at reducing debt and reducing public deficits and getting your banks back into operation, and that means compulsorily requiring them to increase their capital so they can stop being zombies and start lending into the real sectors again. And that is a view that is complex, and you can see a good discussion of it in the recent IMF report on the Greek rescue, which starts with some apologies for the IMF's view that they did some things wrongly, but to be fair to them, reflects the very complex economic and political situation prevailing there. But that contrasts with what I might loosely call the Krugman-Stiglitz view, which many others would associate themselves with, saying that in this period of no growth, the last thing you need is fiscal contraction. You need fiscal expansion, even if it's unclear quite how the financial markets are going to regard lending more to Greece or whatever the economy is. And you also need to have quantitative easing not tapering off, you need to have it increasing. And banks they would look to and point the finger at as being a prime cause of the problems and not really an opportunity for the solutions. This argument, as you all know, has been going backwards and forwards. You can't miss it. It doesn't matter whether you read blogs, whether you read establishment press, popular press, or the New York Review of Books. It's all there in your face. It came to a head recently when a university student at the University of Massachusetts tried to replicate some of Reinhart and Rogoff's workings and was unable to do so, and on further examination discovered that they'd made some quite significant data omissions. They'd left out some countries. They completely left out New Zealand. I don't know how they could do that. They also left out some years. When the data was reworked on one of these publications, the results were considerably weakened. Krugman picked up on this with some anger and has used it to argue that the whole austerity debate has been misaligned and should never have happened. Actually, however, in fairness to Reinhart and Rogoff, their broad results did stand for this paper, and they certainly do for many of their other papers. And they are supported by many other pieces of work, such as those by the Bank of International Settlements. Many of the central banks own pieces of work, and you can't go to Jackson Hole in Wyoming conferences without hearing discussions on all of this. Of course, in the meantime, we've seen some very radical and unusual policies put in place, and this is quantitative easing. So the G4 economies have done massive and hugely radical things, and the people who have done this are what I would have thought of a few years ago as hugely conservative central bank governors, who, seeing the problems with fiscal policy and sometimes indeed with the political economy of countries, have worked out they need to push everything into monetary policy and have put in place zero interest rates, considerable quantitative easing, something that we hardly knew about only a few years ago. And if you add this up, over the period since the global financial crisis, we think that there's been something like 10 trillion US dollars pushed through economies through quantitative easing. That is 10 trillion. I know you can't particularly react to that because you have no way of knowing what $1 trillion looks like, but it's a huge amount, far more than we would ever talk about in policy terms before. The lines between fiscal policy and monetary policy in the financial sector have become blurred, but more than ever, we understand that each of those policies to be effective needs friends. Reinhart and Rogoff have written about that. They say you can't have fiscal policy without some ability to work through a difficult situation where you've got financial market seizures. You can't have monetary policy without some way of working through monetary policy illiquidity periods. Financial markets are the channel through which many of these policies have to work, and if those are in trouble, then your other policies are in trouble. But that is where I would like to introduce where the Reinhart-Rogoff work goes from a policy point of view, the new economic friend of this third winter, and that is macro-financial policies, which for many economies are new and we are still thinking about them. But the problems here are not just macroeconomic, they're macro-financial as well. And we have learnt the dangers of what happens when you get asset prices building up, big bubbles, when you get credit expansion beyond certain levels. And if you've got international banks and global competitiveness, that's a pretty dangerous mix for an economy. We've seen many economies, Singapore, New Zealand included, focusing on micro-prudential policies, and that broadly means moving for their banking sector regulations from Basel I, Basel II to Basel III. That means recalibrating capital and liquidity and putting some other requirements in place. These are fixed requirements. They're rules that banks have to meet right through a cycle. But in addition, we're seeing a lot more on what we're calling macro financial policies. And this, for some of us, is new stuff. It means that authorities intervening on balance sheets of banks, intervening on lending for banks, and this is much more, in my view, more transitional. And indeed, this is why the plum blossom is such an important symbol, because these policies can only work for a certain amount of time, beyond which banks and people are clever enough to find ways around that. We know that in New Zealand because we had a lot of these policies in the 1970s. Very quickly, people found a way to disintermediate the regulator in all of this, and the same will happen again. Well, just last time, going back to personal experiences at the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, we received in 2007 some extra financial stability powers from the government, and we had already, for some time, in fact, we pioneered in 2004 public financial stability reports, reporting on the financial stability of the country. We put in place Basel III requirements, a New Zealand version of Basel III for our banks. And we now investigated macro financial policies and have declared that the core funding ratios, the countercyclical buffers, sectoral capital requirements, loan-to-value ratios are all tools that we might look at. And indeed, my successor as central bank governor is this week making some announcements, and he may have something to say about those things. Now, in this case, New Zealand wasn't the pioneer. Actually, for experience, we looked at Singapore and some of the East Asian economies that have had a much longer and more confident record of the government, mainly through central banks, putting in place regulations on different classes of lending. And we're trying to understand what works and what things people find their way around. Well, ladies and gentlemen, just to sum up, this has really been a story of what I've seen as three friends of Winter: Keynes, who pioneered modern fiscal policy; Phillips, who pioneered modern monetary policy; Reinhart and Rogoff, who had a big role in modern macro financial policy. One was confronted by the Great Depression and wrote the general theory. One was confronted by the great inflation and had put in place the Phillips Curve. One by the global financial crisis, and this time is different. It's a more complicated story than I'm giving you a picture, but this is my simple framework that's there. Let's go back at last to the picture of the three friends of winter. The traditional Chinese painter was a learned scholar. He, because it was he, used ground up willow charcoal to get a pigment, together with earth pigments, used brushes made from particular animal hairs, and spent many hours, sometimes years, painting pictures like this. The modern painter of Chinese ink brush paintings is an enthusiastic amateur, using synthetic materials, synthetic brushes and polymer wherever possible, and knocking off a masterpiece in an evening class in a night. It's a bit like that in economics now, because to reconstruct the famous quote from Richard Nixon, he was talking about Keynesian, we're all economists now, and those of you who came in a taxi today will have had the benefit, no doubt, of your taxi driver giving you some advice, and we all have access to laptops, cell phones, and whatever data we really want. Traditionally, there were three plants of winter that embarked on the ideals of the Confucian scholar, who was surely the forerunner of the economic policy analyst today, and who knew that he had to be prepared to face tenacity in the face of adversity. We're watching now how together the endurance of the pine, the flexibility of the bamboo, and the flowering of the plum blossom are all standing up against the harsh wintry landscape of the global financial crisis. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you for staying on for this Q&A session. I'm sure you all agree with me that we have the most stimulating talk today. I'd like to actually change the format a little bit. Usually I ask the first question, but today I will keep my question to myself. Yeah, please use the mic on both ways. Henry, you have a question?
That gentleman first?
Yes, if you like.
Okay. Professor, I have two questions. The first, in the contextual setting of the inflation targeting, Because we understand that New Zealand was the most successful. You are the one who put up that inflation targeting policy, and in the 2008 crisis, those countries as inflation targeting is the least affected. But one question I have is that at that time when you put up the inflation targeting, inflation is the problems. So the inflation targeting has a monetary supply moderation effect, has a fiscal side constraint effect. Now, right now, all those countries who is trying to copy the inflation targeting, like the Fed, like the Japanese central bank, they're under deflationary environment. So if they adopt inflation targeting, that means monetary expansions, that means fiscal deficit widening. And I'm thinking about that one question we don't forget to address is that when the Great Moderation comes, actually it's the Chinese labor supply deflation that caused the problem. Now, if you're going to have these developing countries who keep on exporting supply-side deflations, will this Japanese and the Fed adoption of inflation targeting become very dangerous?
Thank you for the question. I can't comment on other countries' monetary policies other than to quote Zhou Enlai talking about the French Revolution, saying it's too early to tell how successful that is in Japan yet. Of course, he thought he'd been asked about the student riots in Paris at the time, but the interpreter thought he was talking about the 1789 French Revolution. But we've got a little way to go, I think, before we can judge what's happening in Japan. But if your question is really saying how relevant is inflation targeting today when you've got a lot of countries suffering problems, but they're not inflation problems, that is an interesting question, and it's going to be one for clever minds around SMU and elsewhere as to how to deal with economies that don't have consumer price inflation, like New Zealand. It's 0.7% at the minute, but they do have house price inflation, stock market price inflation, other asset price inflation, and maybe a very high level of credit growth, and that's quite an interesting problem out there. Sorry, I'm not quite answering your questions, but I'm deliberately being a bit circumspect.
Good morning. My name is Taimur Nabili. I'm with Channel News Asia. Professor, you've described the 100 years in which great minds have finessed policy, have addressed crisis, have come to policy conclusions and analysis. And yet, at the end of that century, we arrived in the late 2000s at a point where the current great minds were telling us we had achieved the great moderation. We had arrived at a stable stasis in economic policy making, in global trade and economy, by and large. I mean, and people were saying this time it's different. Those people that you mentioned who were predicting crisis were told, no, this time it's different. We have the tools under our control, we have the management, and we have the history to guide us in the future. And yet we arrived at one of the greatest crises we've ever seen. So my question is, how did we end up there? Was this a failure of policy making? Was this a failure of strategizing? Was this a failure to see the problems before us in terms of the policy makers? Or was this a consequence of moral failure? Was this the consequence of a trading environment, a business environment in which we had a new dynamic in the economy and in the markets that no one really understood or was able to control?
Well, it's you and the Queen of England together, really. And after she had opened the building, the director of London School of Economics at the time, Sir Howard Davies, went away and wrote a book called What Are the Causes of the Global Financial Crisis? He had 32 chapters in it, and each of them had a different cause. So it's complicated, obviously, but it does seem like it was a combination of things, some of them quite unexpected, with a contagion that was very unexpected. And I guess you can say that some economists, some regulators, certainly some bankers, some boards of directors, and some risk managers and some mathematical economists all should eat some humble pie over that, insofar as things happened that they didn't expect to happen in a way they didn't expect to happen. But having said all that, just one comment on the Great Moderation. Yeah, this was a phrase that went around. I do recall in 2006 having lunch with one of the major central bank governors, I won't tell you which one, and he said, I am very worried about this phrase. People are starting to believe it. It didn't come from us. And that probably was the view around the central bank community, that we don't expect to see moderation forever. I mean, if you see moderation forever, you don't need economists, and we don't expect that to happen either. So it's there were huge surprises there, and we have to learn from them. But we have done a bit of work looking at where economists are spending their time now, and there's a huge outpouring of work going on in the financial macroeconomic interface to try and build up a better learning from all of this, and there's massive amounts of re-regulation going on, some of which will be over the top, no doubt, also. Overall, I'm pretty optimistic, however. I mean, let's bear in mind, we're in a region which has seen the biggest growth the world has ever known in its human history, and it's brought more people out of poverty than the world has ever known, and I think that will continue. So I regard this as something which we will be on top of, but it's going to take a long time in some countries.
Well, the great moderation actually was coined by two econometricians, Stock and Watson. Well, they have used the term for different reasons. I guess the community interpret it in a different way. Another question?
Can I just respond to that? Yes, I was there when they gave that paper at Jackson Hole, and the general feeling around the central bank community was they didn't like it, they didn't believe it. I know it was an econometric paper.
So, look like, we have this central bank econometrician rivalry here. Any other question on the floor? Anybody, envisage yourself as a central banker? I do have a question regarding the transitory role of Plum. You in the end of your talk, you remarked that the impact of macro-prudential policy is more transitory. That's certainly manifest in many countries' experience with controlling real estate bubbles using macro-prudential policy, including Singapore. I wonder what are the reasons why those impacts are more transitory. There are any economic and or psychological reason in your view?
Well, I can't talk about Singapore on that, but to me, a policymaker has to always be very aware of the limitations of their tools and the mechanisms they've got for putting those in place. And those, of course, absolutely do depend on the population that they are being applied to and the channels they're going through. And indeed, that was part of the Lucas critique, saying, actually, people are more clever than you think. They look through your policies, they predict them, and they'll take action to minimise their effect if it's in their interest to do that. And that's a lesson that's salutary, and we've all got to bear that in mind. I made those remarks about the transitory nature of some macro financial policies in an economy like New Zealand's, because we have seen in the 1970s what happens if you try and put ones like that in place, admittedly in a very different time period with a different financial market structure. We ended up with very big distortions as a result of that. My memory was someone proudly telling me that they'd managed to get a top-up bank loan for their house in the name of their dog. Now, that's something that gets around loan-to-value ratios. But once you see that happening, there's something difficult in the economy. Other economies, that may not happen, and governments and regulators may have a much better ability to channel through impacts and have the sort of impact they want. But our view in one area like New Zealand is if you go around that and disintermediate, people will find their ways around. And indeed, part of our financial crisis was some failures of finance companies, pretty little things. When did they come from? They'd all come from the 1970s as ways to get around the banks, which are being regulated. So it is worth thinking about that as well.
Hi, my name is Xiao Qiang. I come from a company called Murex, a software vendor for banks. My question is regarding the financial innovations and the financial engineering. So on the technology side, people see that all the new innovation seems to push people's life be much, much better. On the financial side, I guess it's similar things. A lot of derivatives, interest rates, swaps, and things like that actually facilitate international trade and economy. But recent crisis also quite often blamed on the derivatives of subprime credit derivatives and things like that. And the bank's regulations nowadays seems to have put on enormous amount of additional capital requirements. So it translates into the cost of doing this business. What's your view on this direction? You're saying that it seems to say that in your talk that the banks or financial companies seems to be playing a big part of bringing down this crisis, but you wouldn't count on them to get it back. What do you think the role is going forward, and whether you should still encourage innovations, or how strict you should regulate them or prohibit them or be cautious?
Yes, if you read about the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos in the United States after the war, you get this picture of all these really, really clever rocket scientists designing radioactive materials and technologies and thinking we could do all these incredible things. And in a way, that's a little bit similar to the discussions that were there around the 2000s amongst the financial engineers, who were all very clever, had PhDs in maths and engineering and so on, and weren't properly contained in the environment that you would want them to be in. In my view, if you can't explain how a financial instrument works to your board of directors, then it's questionable whether you should be allowed to do it. I do recall at one of the Bank of International Settlements meetings in 2006, before the crisis, we had a presentation by a professor at Stanford Business School, and he said, look, there's this new instrument I've just heard about. It's got a CDS here. You take it in, you resyndicate it, you synthesize it, you cut it this way, you sell it back into the market, you pull it back there, you cut it horizontally as well, and then you put it through a distribution simulator and it goes back in there, and then this way you get rid of any risk out of there. And he stopped and he looked around the room and said, none of you can understand what I'm talking about, can you? And then he said, and the worry is that there's only 100 people in the world who could, and you don't employ any of them in your central bank because you can't afford them, and you better worry about that. And I took that on board. I think that was a sort of moment when I think a number of us thought there is stuff that's potentially dangerous if it's not properly in its governance setting. And its governance setting should be a risk management unit properly staffed, which is able to overrule clever trading units that can make short-term money.
Great. We have a couple of minutes for one more question. Would you like to use the mic?
My name is Chen Jipeng. I'm from Xinhua News Agency. Actually, my question is it's also about Chinese economy. But you know that if you look at the Chinese economic policy making, usually the government seems to care more about employment. But if you do inflation targeting, there seems to be a trade-off. How do you deal with that?
Well, the story of that has all been written in the Phillips Curve controversy as to whether you can have both, or whether you can be precise about going for one or the other, and under what conditions you can only do that in a short term or do it in a long term. But we know economics has to be in a setting where governments and people have got multiple goals, not just one. So I can't comment particularly about what's happening at the moment. But of course, any country wants to ensure that they've got policies that all fit together, are aiming at multiple goals simultaneously.
Well, let me rejoin a little bit. It seems to me Chinese government ultimate goal at the moment is to promote growth rather than emphasize the full employment. Am I correct by saying that?
But actually, from what I know in the past, I mean, especially during the financial crisis, actually, that's a way they rolled out the 4 trillion yuan stimulus. Actually, that's I think that was basically because of they had concerns about employment at that time, especially that so many migrant workers actually began to go back home from the cities.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about regarding the Chinese economy. I also would like to take the opportunity to say something on behalf of my president. We are going to, SMU is going to organize a conference related to Chinese economy in November, right? So, I welcome all of you to come back. And I guess we could probably have a time for one more quick question, if there's any. Yes? Would you mind using the mic?
Right. My name is Aaron Kalshika. I'm with Oklana Asset Management. Just a quick question with respect to currency wars. And obviously, fundamental economic policy focusing on inflation and growth going forward. But ultimately, we're also seeing, a couple of motivations on the part of, politicians, of the part of administrations, and even on the part of central banks. We've seen huge movements of late over the last few months, last 6 months or so in Japan. That's really been a tandem of those policies coming to fruition because we've had a consensus between central banks and politicians. I'd like you, if you can, please just share your thoughts on what have been your experiences and possibly just your outlook going forward.
Well, you don't put $10 trillion into the world economy and not have some distortions and spillover effects. And of course, quantitative easing in a whole range of economies has had very big spillover effects. Go and look on the IMF website if you're interested. You'll see some things they call the spillover reports, which are very good. Unfortunately, they don't seem to get a lot of airtime, and actually exchange rates seem to be something that is considered dirty talk around some international organisation tables. But it's part of life for a place like Singapore or New Zealand, and there's now a large number of smaller open economies that have had to deal with the capital flows issues and the exchange rate spillover effects that have come from quantitative easing, not just out of Japan, but from Europe, UK and US as well. That is a reality of doing economic policy in a small open economy. You deal with what's coming your way, but it doesn't mean you necessarily like it or it's necessarily in your interests. I think if you look at some of those economies, you can see the corrosive effect of strong exchange rates. Of course, now the financial markets with tapering are arguing that we may have to face the opposite impacts on capital flow outflows and exchange rate reduction, but that's yet to be seen. It is a complicated, volatile world through this period.
Okay, great. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Alan Bollard once again for this most wonderful and stimulating public lecture, for summarizing what had happened in the last 100 years for the 3 financial crises in the most succinct way. Please join me to thank him once again.
May I invite Prof. Yu to present on our behalf a token of appreciation to Dr. Bollard. It was certainly well worth the wait, and without giving too much away, perhaps after waiting another 2 more seasons when we transition to spring, we may have you back.